Max Robinson sat alone in the attic, his trembling hands brushing away years of dust from an old wooden chest. His heart pounded as he opened the trunk, a relic he hadn't dared to touch since the day he got back from the Vietnam War. Inside were fragments of a life he'd buried, a faded photo of himself in uniform, a rusted dog tag, and a sealed envelope with yellowed edges. The sight of it made his stomach churn. His name was scrawled across the front in delicate, unfamiliar handwriting. Maxwell Robinson. Open, only, when you're ready. Ready? He'd never been ready. The envelope sat there, a silent reminder of a past he'd worked so hard to forget. Memories flooded back, the oppressive jungle heat, the deafening roar of helicopters, the haunting eyes of Mai. Her face was the last thing he wanted to see, and yet it was all he could picture now. Max's fingers hovered over the envelope. The last time he'd seen it, he'd promised himself he'd never open it. But now, alone in a house that felt more like a tomb, he couldn't ignore it any longer. His hands trembled as he tore the seal. The first line hit him like a punch to the gut. "Max, you lied to me. You promised you'd come back. You never even said goodbye." His breath caught. He gripped the edge of the chest to steady himself. The words were from her. Mai, the woman he'd left behind. But it wasn't just her words that haunted him. It was the final sentence at the bottom of the page, scribbled in a shaky hand as if written in desperation. "Your son deserves to know the truth." His son? Max blinked, the words blurring in front of him. His chest tightened. He wanted to believe this was some cruel joke. But deep down, he knew it wasn't. "Impossible," he whispered, his voice barely audible. But the letter trembled in his hands like proof of a truth he'd spent decades trying to forget. The attic seemed to close in on him, the air growing colder. He stood, clutching the letter, and stumbled down the stairs. If this was real, if Mai had been telling the truth, then everything he thought he'd left behind was about to resurface. He reached the kitchen and poured himself a glass of whiskey. The amber liquid burned his throat, but it didn't chase away the ache in his chest. For years, he'd avoided his past. The war had taken enough from him. His friends, his youth, his peace. And now this? Max stared at the letter again. What if he really had a son? Could he still be alive? Was he out there somewhere, wondering why his father had abandoned him? The questions swirled in his mind, each one cutting deeper than the last. He'd built walls around himself to protect from pain like this. Walls so thick, even his children, Helen and Robert, couldn't break through. But the letter had shattered everything. That night, Max lay awake, staring at the ceiling. The weight of the letter sat heavy on his chest. His mind raced back to Vietnam, to the village where he met Mai, to the promises he made but couldn't keep. He had to tell someone, Helen or Robert. But how? They already resented him for being absent for most of their lives. This revelation would only push them further away. And yet, he couldn't keep this to himself anymore. By morning, Max had made up his mind. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. His hands no longer trembled, not because he wasn't afraid, but because he knew there was no turning back. He had to face the truth. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He hadn't called Helen or Robert in months. Their strained relationships were his doing, and he knew it. How could he ask them to understand something he barely understood himself? Finally, he dialed Helen's number. It rang 3 times before her curt voice answered. "Dad? Is everything okay?" "Helen?" Max hesitated, his throat dry. "I need you and Robert to come over. There's something I need to tell you. It's important." Helen's silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. "Are you sick?" she finally asked, her voice softening. No, it's not that. Just come, please." "Fine," she replied, her tone distant. "I'll call Robert." By the time they arrived that afternoon, Max had paced the house so many times, he thought he'd wear out the floorboards. Helen walked in first, her arms crossed, her expression guarded. Robert followed, looking less tense but equally wary. "Dad, what's going on?" Helen asked. her eyes scanning the room as if searching for some hidden clue. Max gestured toward the couch. "Sit down, I need to tell you both something about Vietnam." Helen frowned, leaning back. "Vietnam? Why now?" "Because I've been hiding something for too long," Max said, his voice trembling. He pulled the letter from his pocket and placed it on the coffee table. "I found this last night. It's from someone I knew there. Someone important." Robert leaned forward, squinting at the envelope. "What's in it?" Max hesitated, then unfolded the letter and read it aloud. His voice cracked as he reached the final line. "Your son deserves to know the truth." Helen's mouth fell open. "A son? What are you talking about, Dad?" "I didn't know," Max said quickly, his eyes pleading for understanding. "At least not for sure. Mai and I, we were close. But when I left Vietnam, I didn't think." "You didn't think?" Helen interrupted, her voice sharp. "You left a child behind? How could you?" "I didn't know," Max snapped, his voice rising. "And even if I had, what could I have done? I barely made it out alive." The room fell silent. Robert looked down at his hands, his jaw tight. Helen shook her head, her eyes glistening. "You've spent your whole life running, Dad," she said quietly. "From us, from Mom. And now this? What else are you hiding?" Max clenched his fists. "I'm telling you now because I need your help. If there's a chance he's alive, I have to find him." Helen stood abruptly, pacing the room. "This is insane. How do we even know this is real? That she wasn't lying?" "She wasn't lying," Max said firmly. "I know Mai. She wouldn't have written this unless it was true." Robert finally spoke, his voice calm, but strained. "Okay, say it's true. What do you want us to do? Fly to Vietnam? Hire a private investigator? Do you even have anything to go on?" Max reached into the chest he'd brought down from the attic and pulled out an old photograph. It was of Mai, standing in front of a small wooden house. Scrawled on the back were a name and a village. "This is all I have," he admitted. Helen stared at the photo, her expression softening slightly. "And you think this is enough to find him? After all these years?" Max's voice broke as he whispered, "I have to try." Robert nodded slowly. "If this is what you need, Dad, I'll help. But you have to promise us something." "What's that?" "No more secrets," Robert said, his eyes locking onto Max's. Max swallowed hard, nodding. No more secrets. But as they sat in the dimly lit room, the weight of what lay ahead pressed down on all of them. The journey they were about to embark on wasn't just about finding Max's son. It was about confronting the ghosts of the past and the scars they'd all carried for far too long. The next morning, Helen sat at her kitchen table, turning the old photograph over in her hands. She couldn't stop staring at Mai's face, the warm smile, the hopeful glint in her eyes. It felt strange, thinking about a woman she'd never met, but who had played such a significant role in her father's life. Her thoughts were interrupted by the buzz of her phone. It was Robert. "I did some digging," he said, without preamble. "The village on the photo still exists. It's small and remote, but people live there." Helen exhaled slowly, her fingers tightening around the phone. "Do you think we'll actually find someone, after all this time?" "I don't know," Robert admitted. "But Dad's not going to stop until we try, and maybe he needs this." Helen sighed. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive him, Rob. Not for everything." "I'm not saying you have to," Robert replied. "But we can't keep running in circles. If we don't do this, it'll eat him alive. And maybe us too." Later that evening, they gathered at Max's house. The living room felt heavier than usual, filled with unspoken tension. Max had spread out maps and old documents across the coffee table, his hands shaking as he pointed to locations. "This is where the village is," he said, tapping the map. "I remember it like it was yesterday. The rice fields, the narrow dirt paths. It's burned into my memory." Helen sat back, crossing her arms. "And what happens if we go there, Dad? What if he doesn't want to be found? What if—" Max interrupted, his voice breaking. Then at least I'll know. At least I'll have tried. The room fell silent. Helen exchanged a glance with Robert, who gave her a small, encouraging nod. "Fine," she said finally, her voice softening. "Let's do this. Let's find him." Max's eyes welled up, but he quickly turned away, pretending to organize the scattered papers. "Thank you," he murmured. As the family sat together, piecing together fragments of Max's past, an air of cautious hope settled over them. For the first time in decades, they were united. Not by love, but by the chance to heal. They immediately left on the first plane. The plane touched down in the small rural province just before dawn. The air was thick with humidity, and the distant sounds of chirping insects filled the silence. Max stepped off first, gripping his cane tightly as he scanned the horizon. Helen and Robert followed close behind, their expressions a mix of trepidation and exhaustion. A local guide met them, holding a hand-drawn map that marked the path to the village. The drive was long and winding, the car bouncing over uneven dirt roads. Helen sat quietly, staring out the window at the lush green countryside. For a moment, it was almost peaceful, until her father spoke. "This road," Max whispered, his voice cracking. "I remember this road." Robert glanced back at him. "Are you sure, Dad?" Max nodded. "We walked this way after the ambush. It was where everything went wrong." The weight of his words lingered, pressing down on all of them. No one dared to ask what he meant. Not yet. By the time they reached the village, the sun was high in the sky. Small houses with tin roofs and colorful laundry strung across lines came into view. Children ran barefoot through the dusty streets, their laughter a stark contrast to Max's heavy heart. The guide stopped the car and turned to Max. "This is it. The elder still remembers the war. He might know something." Max hesitated, his hands trembling as he opened the door. Helen placed a reassuring hand on his arm. "We'll do this together, Dad." Taking a deep breath, Max stepped forward, his past and present colliding with every shaky step. They went inside and sat down. The elder's small home smelled of incense and aged wood. Max sat across from him, his hands clasped tightly together, his gaze fixed on the weathered man. Helen and Robert stood silently behind him, their presence grounding him as he prepared for the weight of the moment. The elder studied Max's face, his own eyes clouded with memories. "You were here during the war," he said in halting English. "You carry its shadow." Max nodded, his throat tightening. I think I hurt someone here. A family." The elder's gaze softened and he nodded slowly. There was a family. A father, a mother, a child. They lost their home, their lives shattered. But the child, she survived. Max froze, his heart pounding. "The child? She's alive?" The elder motioned to a door. A woman stepped out, her hair streaked with gray, her expression unreadable. Max's breath caught. It was her. The girl from that day, grown, alive, and standing before him. Tears blurred his vision as he whispered, "I'm so sorry. For everything." The woman spoke softly, her words tinged with sadness but not anger. "War takes from everyone, but it also gives a chance to heal." Max broke down, decades of guilt pouring out of him. Helen and Robert rushed to his side, holding him as he finally released the burden he'd carried for so long. Outside, the village was quiet, the air heavy with an unspoken understanding. Max looked at his children, his voice steadier now. "Maybe it's not too late. For any of us."